The first thing we heard from the interdicted shrine barge was a human jawbone speaking perfect Binharik at 128 Hz, in a vacuum, with no tongue, no lung, and no atmosphere to bear the sound. The grill of the primary vox on Sanctum Sicarus bore that jaw like a relic's bite, and it clicked out clean machine cant. Skin remembers geometry. The words vibrated through the docking collar of the Sanction of Talix, as if the void itself had become a resonant cavity. I am Magos Biologis Errant Thalassa 43, writ and sealed by the fabricator locum of Vesta Hives, seconded to Ordo Hereticus Audit under Inquisitor Verate Malchior. I logged what the jaw said and what the sensors didn't and what my bones did, because bones are instruments too, and my spine registered the psalm as a gentle thrumming ache exactly every 7.8 seconds. We hung in high orbit over the thing like a bead of cold oil, our quarantine torus, a luminous ring of contrition burning out with each incremental tick of unaccounted power drain. The torus would fail in 18 hours by my models, 17 hours 52 minutes by the Inquisitor's stricter calculus. The torus failure meant open space for whatever had nested beneath that barge's iconography, and so the orders came as ritual and command braided together: verify, extract, or purge. It had been seized from word-bearers in a splinter action around the Haskell-Nime gas giant a cycle prior, an enemy offering disguised as a hulked shrine. Even burned and tagged, its hull presented as sanctified cedar in lacquered ceramite, gilt edgework devout to the point of insult. Frost limned every line of its plating in a rhyme that should not have formed. We measured no moisture out there, yet hoarfrost crept like breath over glass, patterning in octagonal rosettes that took and shed light in ways the augurs struggled to resolve. The absence was as loud as the jaw was clear. No heat signatures, no off-gassing, no micro-debris cloud you expect from a dead barge. Just silence, and 128 Hz. My augmetic eye focused through the observation blister, watching ice crystals form impossible geometric patterns across the shrine barge's hull. Perfect octagons nested within octagons, defying the random chaos that should govern frozen moisture in the void. The atmospheric readings from within the derelict vessel showed knife-cold air impossibly dry, yet thermal imaging detected consistent hoarfrost formation throughout its corridors. Each measurement contradicted the last, creating a symphony of impossible data that made my neural processors ache with the effort of reconciliation. Under the humming deck of the Sanction of Talix, I recited the litany of insulation with my tongue and my internal noosphore both, tasting machine oil and copper through a palate half iron, half meat. Sister Hospitaller Salome sprinkled blessed solvent on our boots, the droplets beading into perfect spheres and holding there like eyes made of water. Skitari Alpha Vrax 7 checked, field limbs and vernier calibrations, with the dead calm of a man who had replaced so much of himself that the remaining flesh had learned obedience by example. 2 naval armsmen raised brows just enough for my auspex to register their pulse dilation. Voidmaster Corda, a thin woman with a voice like a poorly tuned auspex, gripped the boarding umbilicus lever with hands that had guided ships through the warp and lived to remember the geometry of impossible spaces. Inquisitor Malchior's rosette glinted under its purity seals, a heavy sun over her sternum. The paper tabs shivered though there was no draft. At my request, she granted me the authority of Ordnance Sigma Red, heretic artifact chain of custody. It is a comfort to make a protocol into a shield, even when you know shields are lies. Her weathered face remained impassive as she spoke, each word measured and deliberate, carrying the weight of absolute authority earned through decades of purging heretical corruption from the Imperium's flesh. The quarantine torus continues to degrade due to parasitic power draw from an unknown source. We have less than 18 hours before containment fails completely. I performed a quick rite over my instruments, cooling vents singing as I intoned binary supplications, backward and forward, alternating pairwise like braided ligaments. The jawbone continued its psalm. With each cycle, it struck the same 128 Hz. But on the 4th repetition, Subharmonics appeared, a nest of tiny ghosts under the pure tone. The sanctions deck plating answered them like a choir under the floor. The temperature in the docking bay dropped by 3 degrees without any rational vector of heat loss, frost feathering outward from the last boot scuff like ice seeing the path it wanted to take. Through the noospheric link, I detected the faint harmonic resonance that had been troubling the frigate's machine spirits since we had established quarantine orbit, as if the ship itself were slowly learning to sing in harmony with the derelict vessel we guarded. "Cut and board," Inquisitor Malchior said, voice flat, ritual ready. "We proceed by the book to the end, Magos. I want it on the record." Her bolt pistol hung at her side, its consecrated ammunition blessed against corruption both material and spiritual, the weapon's machine spirit humming in harmony with the distant, barely audible hymnal that seemed to emanate from the shrine barge itself. "It is on the record," I said, and my vox string whispered the same words to the mission log as if it wanted them to be written twice. Repetition is a form of prayer. The umbilicus extended with a hiss like an old lung, pneumatic systems cycling with whispers that seemed to carry meaning in their expelled atmosphere. Beyond the seal, Sanctum Sicarus loomed against the starwash, a scab of sacred geometry with hull etchings that looked like scripture until you stared and realized the lines were stitches. My augmetic fingers pressed against the reinforced transparasteel of the umbilical viewport, and I felt the impossible truth register in my neural processors like a blade sliding between ribs. The shrine barge's mass was increasing, incremental, neat, as if a careful hand was placing more weight upon a scale beyond our sight. 0.4%, then 0.6, then 0.8% growth, with no measurable ingress of matter. The numbers twitched in their columns, steady, then not, then steady again, asserting a new physical rule with the inexorable logic of a mathematical proof. "It's pulling something," Corda whispered. "Not on the channel, just human to human. Or being fed." Her words fogged in air that should not fog, and we all saw it and pretended it was the pre-mission chill. My auspex flickered once, twice, then resolved with the neat little curve it conjures for an impossible thing that it cannot refuse to describe, but refuses to explain. "Mass increase recorded," I said for the log. "No ingress vectors. This is anomaly secundus. Recommend—" "Entry," Inquisitor Malchior said, and her tone was the sound of a seal being peeled from flesh. "We are already running backward against a clock that does not love us. There is no recommendation left to make." She stepped into the boarding umbilical, and the chronometer's amber numerals continued their relentless countdown as we crossed the threshold between vessels, leaving behind the familiar warmth and light of imperial technology for the cold geometries waiting in the darkness ahead. I looked once more through the umbilical viewport. The frost on the shrine's hull was not random. Octagons within octagons nested in 8 tiers. The pattern flared with thin bioluminescence at the intersection points like stars in a different sky, each pulse syncopated to the 128 Hz in a ratio that scratched at the inside of the teeth. In the jawbone's clicks I heard an old oath from my apprenticeship, mispronounced with intention enough to make the mistake sacred, a misstep elevated by use. It is a seduction to hear your past spoken in the present tense by a dead mouth. We carried our guns and our prayers and our names. We carried weights that do not show on a scale. The umbilical locks opened with a chitter that echoed insect and holy writ in a pleasing hybrid. The seal rolled aside on its tracks and exposed the passage into the shrine barge, which waited like a throat. Air did not flow because there was none, and yet something like a draught pulled across the surface of my lips, and I tasted boiled leather where only the taste of my own mouth should have been. "By the Omnissiah, and for the preservation of mankind, by mandate of Ordo Hereticus," Verate Malchior said, and she did not whisper this time. "Board." We stepped as one, the bay lights strobing once as if to bless the move. My boots hit the umbilicus floor, and the metal sang faintly at the 128th note, that psalm that had crawled into my vertebrae and would not leave. The hatch into Sanctum Sicarus unsealed. The jaws clicked their benediction, and the weight of the barge climbed another clean 0.8% while every sensor screamed, "No, nothing has changed. Nothing at all." The hatch dilated with the slow reverence of an eyelid opening to unwelcome light, and we stepped from the umbilical into air that should not have existed. The atmosphere struck exposed skin like ground glass, knife cold at exactly -12 degrees Celsius, impossibly dry despite the hoarfrost that limned every surface in crystalline filigree. My olfactory senses registered ozone mixed with the distinct scent of boiled leather, a combination that made my augmetic palate water with phantom saliva. The corridor beyond stretched like a nave frozen in prayer, its ceramite bulkheads lacquered to mimic altar wood, with grain patterns that followed no tree that had ever grown in the Emperor's light. Formation established itself through habit and catechism. Skitari Alpha Vrax 7 took point position, his galvanic rifles targeting cogitator painting red acquisition dots across the frost-covered walls, while his optical suite fed tactical data through our shared noospheric link. The two naval armsmen fell into staggered flanking positions, creating overlapping fields of fire like interlaced fingers of death. Voidmaster Corda watched our rear approach with the practiced vigilance of someone who had survived too many derelict vessel explorations, while Sister Hospitaller Salome moved with fluid grace, her medical kit secured but accessible for rapid deployment. Inquisitor Malchior maintained center position like a blade in its sheath, her rosette radiating enough warmth to create a visible halo in the frigid atmosphere. The hoarfrost refused to behave according to natural law. Under the focused beam of my thermal scanner, the ice crystals maintained their structure despite direct heat application, creating patterns that hurt to examine directly. Octagons nested within octagons, in arrangements that seemed to recede infinitely inward, each formation containing microscopic etchings of 8-pointed stars carved with surgical precision. Even the rivet patterns in the deck plating followed octagonal clusters rather than load-bearing logic, as if the vessel's construction had prioritized numerological significance over structural integrity. My spine registered the persistent 128 Hz psalm as a gentle, thrumming ache that synchronized perfectly with my chronometer's pulse every 7.8 seconds, creating a rhythm that seemed to resonate in the calcium lattice of my bones. "No heat signatures detected," Vrax 7 reported through clipped Binharic whispers. "No atmospheric movement. No biological presence beyond our own team." His targeting suite continued its methodical sweep, painting threat assessments across surfaces that remained stubbornly empty of targets. "And yet the frost persists," Inquisitor Malchior observed, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had learned to distrust the evidence of her senses. "The mass readings continue their impossible climb. Your assessment, Magos?" "Thermodynamic inversion," I replied, watching my breath condense into crystalline clouds that lingered far longer than atmospheric conditions should have allowed. "The vessel appears to be actively generating cold, while simultaneously accumulating mass from an undetectable source. It represents a fundamental violation of conservation laws." Navigation through the labyrinthine passages revealed the full extent of the spatial anomalies plaguing the vessel. My Auspex mapping systems experienced regular temporal displacement events, during which corridor schematics would reconfigure themselves to show impossible geometries, passages folding back on themselves or extending into dimensions that violated the vessel's external measurements. The phenomenon occurred with mechanical precision, exactly 8 seconds of distorted readings, followed by return to baseline configurations, repeating in perfect synchronization with the subharmonic pulse that thrummed through the deck plating. The absence of debris, corpses, or any evidence of the violent boarding action that had supposedly claimed this vessel from word-bearer forces created a vacuum of wrongness that pressed against my consciousness like physical weight. Every surface gleamed with impossible perfection, as if the ship had been purged by an invisible hand that left behind only cold geometry and the persistent hymnal that seemed to emanate from the vessel's very bones. The scent of boiled leather grew stronger as we progressed deeper, clinging to the interior of my respirator with tenacious persistence. Plus communications. Binharic whisper bursts detected on tertiary channels. Pattern repeats every 7.8 seconds. Translation algorithms unable to parse meaning. The central sanctum revealed itself through massive doors of polished obsidian that reflected our approach in fractured multiplications, each image slightly different from the last. Beyond the threshold lay a theatre of black stone arranged in perfect geometric precision. Glass pews positioned in concentric octagonal rows that caught our lumens and scattered the light in cold, crystalline shards. The chamber stretched upward into shadows that our illumination could not penetrate, creating the impression of vast vertical space contained within dimensions that external measurements indicated should not exist. At the chamber's heart, elevated upon a dais of the same obsidian stone, stood the source of our investigation's focus. The flesh stela rose like a monument to anatomical heresy, human dermis cured and stretched over an unseen armature, its pale surface bearing microscopic suture work that formed text too complex for immediate comprehension. The artifact rested within a field stasis reliquary of imperial manufacture, its containment barrier humming at frequencies that harmonized with the vessel's persistent psalm in ways that made my augmetic hearing sensors register phantom overtones. Heretic Artifact Ordnance Sigma Red, I announced for the mission log, my voice carrying the ritual weight of proper documentation. Chain of custody initiated. Preliminary assessment. Organic construct of human origin, preservation method unknown, contained within Imperial stasis field. The words felt inadequate to describe the wrongness that radiated from the artifact like heat from a corrupted forge. Plus quarantine Taurus, 74% integrity, parasitic draw continuing, T17 31.15 to failure. As I approached the reliquary for initial examination, the stela pulsed once with internal bioluminescence, the light filtering through preserved dermis to reveal structures that my medical training struggled to classify. For exactly 0.8 seconds, the illumination created shadows on the stasis field's transparent barrier, and those shadows resolved into the precise shape of the Omnissiah's sacred cog, rendered to perfect scale but mirror reversed, as if reflected in dark water that refused to show truth. The image burned itself into my visual cortex with picked capture clarity, before fading back to the artifact's dormant state. The ambient hum that had followed us through the corridors intensified by exactly one full register, rising from subsonic ranges into frequencies that made my teeth ache with harmonic resonance. Through the noospheric link, I detected similar frequency patterns beginning to manifest in our equipment's machine spirits, as if the vessel's technological systems were slowly learning to sing in harmony with whatever force animated the flesh stela. "We extract it immediately," Inquisitor Malchior commanded, her bolt pistol remaining holstered, but her hand resting on its grip with unconscious readiness. The rosette at her throat caught the stela's dim bioluminescence and threw it back in fractured patterns that painted 8-pointed stars across the chamber walls. "Whatever corruption has taken root here will not spread beyond this vessel." As she spoke, condensation began forming on surfaces throughout the chamber, despite the impossibly dry atmosphere, stretching between our equipment and the walls in thin filaments that quivered with each breath and footfall. The threads refused to break when disturbed, instead stretching like living tissue with surgical precision. When Armsman Helbig reached out to brush one aside, it adhered to his glove and left behind a perfect seam when peeled away. Not a cut, but a join, as if the material had been opened and resealed with techniques that left his flesh beneath showing a matching line, perfectly healed. The flesh stela pulsed again, brighter this time, and through the containment field came a series of taps that my augmetic hearing registered as Binharic hand code. The pattern spelled out words in the sacred language of the machine. "I remember you." The message repeated 3 times before fading to silence, leaving me to contemplate implications that sent cascades of warning protocols through my neural matrix. I had never encountered this artifact before, yet something within that preserved flesh claimed recognition with the certainty of absolute knowledge. The deck beneath our feet groaned like bone under excessive weight, the sound carrying harmonics of the persistent 128 Hz psalm, as if the ship itself were learning to sing in the artifact's voice. The realization struck me with the force of revelation. We had not discovered the flesh stela through investigation, but rather, it had been waiting for us to arrive, counting down the moments until recognition could become communion. The binharic tapping resonated through the stasis field with mechanical precision, spelling out words that carved themselves into my consciousness like a scalpel through synthetic flesh. I remember you. The message repeated 3 times before fading to silence, leaving me to contemplate implications that sent cascades of warning protocols through my neural matrix. I had never encountered this artifact before, yet something within that preserved flesh claimed recognition with the certainty of absolute knowledge, and fragments of suppressed memory began surfacing from depths I had thought permanently sealed. During my apprenticeship on Vesta Hives, there had been prescribed coursework on living computational matrices, theoretical frameworks for biological information storage that the fabricator Locum had declared heretical and ordered purged from all records. The instructor, Magos Erif, had whispered of flesh that could think, dermis that could remember, skin that could serve as both parchment and cogitator in unholy synthesis. I had reported the transgression and watched him burn, yet now his forbidden knowledge surfaced unbidden, offering context for the abomination before us. My augmetic fingers traced the air above the stela's containment field, as if following patterns I had memorized in another life, each gesture causing the artifact's bioluminescence to intensify in response. Magos! Sister Salome's voice carried the sharp edge of medical concern, her scanner painting diagnostic runes across my form. Your vitals are spiking. Elevated neural activity in sectors associated with memory reconstruction. Her medical training recognized the signs of cognitive intrusion, the telltale patterns of suppressed data forcing its way back to consciousness through proximity alone. The jawbone's psalm from the entry Vox Grill ceased between one moment and the next, leaving behind a silence that felt like held breath. In its place, the flesh stela now responded to the identical 128 Hz frequency channel, its preserved dermis vibrating with subsonic resonance that made the stasis field shimmer like heat distortion over summer stone. The migration of the signal source felt deliberate, purposeful, as if we were witnessing the passing of a torch between different organs of the same vast organism. Plus atmospheric analysis, humidity increasing by exactly 5% per minute, unknown organic compounds at 0.0003% concentration and rising. Phase lag in stasis field, 0.8 nanoseconds. Plus, the humidity spike manifested as thin filaments of condensation stretching between every surface in the chamber, creating a web of moisture that defied atmospheric physics. Each thread quivered with harmonic vibration, responding to our breathing and movement with the sensitivity of living tissue. When Armsman Helbig lifted one condensation thread, it adhered to his glove and left behind a precise suture line when peeled away, not through the material, but revealing a bloodless flesh seam beneath, perfectly healed, as if it had been there for weeks, instead of heartbeats. Litanies of unbinding, Sister Salome intoned, making the sign of the aquila over the reliquary. She began the prayer in precise High Gothic, but 7 syllables in. Her voice stuttered and caught like a thread on a burr. The second attempt snagged in the same place, and a thin line of blood beaded on her lower lip, where she had bitten herself to force the words through the gap. The partial syllable hung in the air, unclaimed, and I realized with growing dread that the artifact was learning our cadences, teaching itself the rhythm of our prayers. Do not repeat it, I warned, harder than intended. It is cataloguing our liturgical patterns. The stella's surface began exhibiting new phenomena under our continued observation. Microscopic protuberances emerged from the preserved dermis, each one shaped like a tiny servo-skull's mandible, extending and retracting in rhythms synchronized with our heartbeats. My medical training recognized the structures as modified cartilage formations, but their purpose remained obscured by alien methodology. The movements created barely audible whispers that my augmetic hearing passed as fragments of High Gothic mixed with corrupted Binharic, prayers spoken in reverse, benedictions transformed into blasphemy through inversion of sacred syllables. Plus noospheric bleed detected. Unauthorized data packets attempting infiltration through proximity sensors. Quarantine protocols engaged. Skitari Alpha Vrax 7 redrew his formation with practiced efficiency, his galvanic rifle sweeping the chamber's periphery, while the two naval armsmen created overlapping fields of fire. The tactical positioning felt more like ritual than defense, a psychological barrier against an enemy that existed in dimensions our weapons could not reach. Voidmaster Corda monitored the reliquary's control interface with weathered hands, making minute adjustments to maintain containment stability as the artifact's influence grew stronger with each passing moment. "The containment field is holding," she reported, voice tight with professional tension. "But I'm reading increasing phase lag in the stasis matrix. 0.8 nanoseconds and climbing. Something's pushing back from inside." The field, designed for perfect stability, was subtly out of sync with its own intended function, as if external forces were gently tugging at its temporal integrity. The flesh stellar pulsed again, brighter than before, and for exactly 0.008 seconds, my display lost the dermis slab image and replaced it with a schematic that was no schematic at all. Pews ribbed like vertebrae, a pulpit that lolled like an extended tongue, organ pipes that resembled tracheal rings cut and polished and set to sing. The image burned itself into my afterimage before returning to the preserved flesh, leaving behind the lingering impression of architectural heresy rendered in living tissue. As I processed this revelation, the Steeler's surface underwent a transformation that defied every principle of preservation science. A cartilage protuberance emerged from the dermis, shaped precisely like a servo skull's mandible, complete with microscopic teeth and jaw articulation. The structure extended fully, flexing as if attempting to speak, before retracting as cleanly as a stitch pulled from a seam. It left the surface smooth and unmarked, with no distortion to show what had tried to be born from preserved flesh. "We extract it immediately," Inquisitor Malchior commanded, her bolt pistol drawn through pointed toward the deck. The rosette at her throat radiated heat through her clothing, creating visible thermal distortion that painted wavering patterns across the chamber walls. "Transport to the Sanction of Talix for continued analysis under loyal machine spirits. Whatever corruption has taken root here will not spread beyond this vessel." Plus quarantine Taurus, 71% integrity. T17 R08 33 to failure. Mass readings, per 1.8% and accelerating. The deck beneath our feet groaned with harmonics that suggested structural stress beyond normal parameters, as if the ship itself were learning to sing in frequencies that resonated with human bone. My augmetic sensors detected micro-vibrations in the hull plating that corresponded to the artifact's pulse patterns, creating sympathetic resonance between the vessel's superstructure and the preserved flesh we prepared to transport. The realization struck me like a bolt round to the chest. We might not be containing the threat, but rather facilitating its migration to a new host. As the team secured the reliquary to grav-assisted trolleys, the condensation filaments followed our progress, stretching and reforming to map our route with deliberate precision. Each thread caught our lumens and scattered the light in patterns resembling neural pathways, as if the ship were developing a nervous system that used our presence as its foundation. The organic compounds in the atmosphere continued their steady increase, reaching concentrations that triggered my biological hazard protocols while remaining just below evacuation thresholds. The ambient hum intensified as we began our extraction, rising by one full register until it became a palpable presence, pressure on the eardrums, vibration in the chest cavity. Through the noospheric link, I detected similar frequency patterns manifesting in our equipment's machine spirits, as if the vessel's technological systems were slowly learning to sing in harmony with whatever force animated the flesh stela. The ship was not merely groaning under impossible weight, it was breathing, and with each exhalation, the boundaries between flesh and metal grew thinner. We moved toward the umbilicus with our luminous burden, the reliquary humming as its field harmonized with the vessel's persistent psalm rather than resisting it. Behind us, the obsidian doors of the sanctum slid shut with a sound like two teeth meeting, sealing away the glass cathedral where something had waited in patient geometry for recognition to become communion. Ahead lay the passage back to imperial space, but I could no longer ignore the growing certainty that we carried more than preserved flesh in our stasis field. We transported a seed of transformation that had already begun teaching our ship new songs to sing. The shuttle's cargo bay received our luminous burden with the reverence of a reliquary, accepting a saint's bones, mag clamps, engaging with deliberate, almost organic cadence that echoed through the reinforced hull like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. We secured the reliquary within the quarantine cradle as condensation threads began forming between every surface. Not random moisture, but deliberate filaments that stretched and parted around our movements, mapping our route like the crude nervous system of something learning to think. The shuttle's recycled atmosphere carried the persistent scent of boiled leather that had saturated my respirator, mixing with ozone and the metallic taste of fear that no filtration system could scrub clean. Through the forward viewport, Sanctum Sicarus receded against the star field like a dark altar set for ceremonies that should never be witnessed, its hull frost blooming into octagonal rosettes that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. Thin black mist clung to its superstructure like ritual incense, creating patterns that hurt to observe directly. Geometry that insisted on being seen while rejecting comprehension. The restraint webbing chafed against my armor with texture that felt wrong, slippery and tacky like wet sinew, despite its synthetic composition, each adjustment only making the sensation more pronounced. Plus pilot. Corda. Pressure stable across all compartments. Transit time, 14 minutes. Fuel mix nominal. Plus quarantine. Taurus, 68% integrity. T16 tangent 31 and 47 to failure. Parasitic draw persistent. So, the authentication request arrived without warning. A series of precise taps resonating through the reliquary's stasis field that my augmetic hearing passed as perfect binharic hand code. The sequence spelled out current MagSeal protocols for the sanction of Talix, classified security codes that had been generated after we established quarantine orbit. The artifact possessed knowledge it could not have acquired through any rational means, yet transmitted our ship's most sensitive access credentials with flawless accuracy, each tap striking the containment frame like a hammer on an anvil. "It knows our lock codes," I reported, the blasphemy of the words burning my throat. Current authentication sequences for systems it has never accessed. The implications cascaded through my neural matrix like poison through bloodstream. If the Stella could access classified Imperial protocols, what other knowledge did it possess? What other systems had it already infiltrated through proximity alone? The memory surfaced unbidden as I processed this violation of security protocols. Do Tertius. The triage station during the orbital bombardment when 37 bodies lay on tables and 15 medici servitors prioritized by flawed Imperial rubric. 8 guardsmen trapped in collapsing trenches, facing certain death. 7 others wounded, but stable, scheduled for extraction. I had used prescribed scrap code, the reversed reductor sequence, to override servitor programming, saving the 8, while condemning the 7 to death through resource diversion. The numbers haunted my data logs like a mathematical proof of damnation. 8 saved, 7 lost, the arithmetic of battlefield necessity that no amount of censure could balance. Plus Sanctum Sicarus mass readings, par 2.1% and accelerating. Source of accretion, undetected. The reliquary's inner shroud, previously confirmed blank during our initial examination, now displayed embroidered text along its edge. 7 incisions, 8-fold knot, stitched in thread that appeared to be human hair, each letter formed with surgical precision. The embroidery showed signs of age and wear consistent with decades of handling, yet had materialized during our brief transit. The stela was working, teaching itself new forms of expression while we carried it toward Imperial Sanctuary. Inquisitor Malchior's rosette radiated heat through her clothing layers, creating thermal patterns that resembled branching neural pathways across her chest. The sacred symbol pulsed with bioluminescence that synchronized with the artifact's rhythm, suggesting resonance between blessed imperial relics and whatever force animated the preserved flesh. Her weathered face remained impassive, but I detected micro-tremors in her hands that indicated involuntary neural firing patterns, the early stages of sympathetic corruption. The shuttle's internal temperature dropped 3 degrees without atmospheric system activation, frost beginning to form on interior surfaces, in the same octagonal arrangements we had observed throughout the shrine barge. My breath condensed into crystalline clouds that lingered far longer than physics should have allowed, each exhalation creating geometric shapes that dissolved only when disrupted by the next breath cycle. Approaching sanction of Talix, docking bay pressurization, normal hull, integrity, nominal. The reliquary's display flickered despite its independent power supply, and for exactly 0.8 seconds, the flesh stela resolved as something far more complex than preserved dermis. The image showed a complete cathedral schematic rendered in living tissue, pews ribbed like vertebrae extending in perfect rows, a pulpit that lolled like an extended tongue inscribed with microscopic text, organ pipes resembling tracheal structures polished to mirror brightness. The architectural blueprint existed in dimensions that folded through spaces our geometry could not accommodate, creating a structure that was simultaneously building and organism, sacred and obscene in equal measure. As we approached the frigate's docking bay, my sensors detected changes in the sanction of Talix that violated every principle of imperial naval architecture. Hull plating bore hairline suture marks arranged in surgical patterns, as if the ship's skin had been opened and resealed using techniques that left no structural weakness, but created pathways for corruption to flow like blood through new vessels. The vessel's mass readings fluctuated in patterns that corresponded to the artifact's pulse, learning to breathe in harmony with whatever force we had brought aboard. The mag clamps engaged with sounds that resembled organic tissue stretching under tension, and I realized with growing horror that the authentication codes had worked. The ship was welcoming us home with systems that no longer functioned according to their original programming. The docking bay's atmospheric barriers sealed with wet sliding noises that had no place in imperial technology, suggesting transformation that preceded our arrival. Plus docking sequence complete. Welcome aboard the sanction of Talix, all systems nominal. I looked down to check the mission chronometer and discovered a fresh suture line tracing a perfect octagonal pattern around my left wrist, the surgical mark showing signs of recent healing despite my certainty that no incision had been made. The flesh sealed with precision that exceeded even my own medical training, pulsing with faint bioluminescence that synchronized perfectly with the artifact's rhythm. As I traced the suture with augmetic fingers, pain ticked through the nerve pathways, like electricity finding new circuits to complete. The shuttle's hatch cycled open with a sigh that sounded too much like relief, revealing the familiar corridors of our frigate, transformed into something that used imperial architecture as camouflage, while growing into forms that no loyal servant of the Omnissiah should recognize. Yet the geometry felt familiar as the rhythm of my artificial heart, as if I had been walking these passages all my life, waiting for the moment when skin would remember what it had always known about the sacred mathematics of flesh and steel joined in unholy communion. The chronometer continued its relentless countdown as we prepared to transfer our burden into what I had believed was imperial sanctuary, but which now revealed itself as merely another organ in an organism that had been growing around us since the moment we first heard the jawbone sing its impossible psalm in the vacuum between stars. The factor-locked cargo bay received our luminous burden with the reverence of a reliquary accepting forbidden scripture, its reinforced bulkheads bearing hairline suture marks that pulsed with faint bioluminescence in patterns resembling neural pathways more than structural engineering. We had sanctified the chamber according to standard Ordo Hereticus protocols before departure, but the modifications now showed signs of organic adaptation that violated every principle of imperial construction. Incense braziers guttered with flames that burned too blue. Atmospheric scrubbers whispered with sounds that suggested breathing rather than mechanical circulation, and lumen strips shifted to sterile white that somehow felt warmer than it should, as if the light itself had learned to comfort rather than merely illuminate. The reliquary settled into its quarantine cradle with mag clamps that engaged in deliberate, almost organic cadence, each connection point humming at frequencies that harmonized with the artifact's persistent 128 Hz psalm rather than resisting it. Condensation threads materialized between every surface despite the chamber's atmospheric controls, stretching from girders to deck plating in patterns that followed weld seams and lattice joins, as if reading architectural text only they could comprehend. When we moved through the chamber, the filaments parted with the faint resistance of skin pulled taut, then rejoined behind us with the soft whisper of sutures closing over fresh wounds. Skitari Alpha Vrax 7 established perimeter security with practiced efficiency, his galvanic rifles targeting cogitator painting red acquisition dots across surfaces that remained stubbornly empty of threats, while his optical suite fed tactical data through our shared noospheric link. The two naval armsmen took staggered flanking positions, creating overlapping fields of fire designed to cut lanes through enemies none of us could name or classify. Sister Hospitaller Salome walked the chamber's perimeter with her auscultator pressed to bulkheads, listening for heartbeats in steel that should not exist, while Voidmaster Corda worked the cargo bay's machine shrine with decisive hands, her murmured petitions to maglock spirits coming out too steady to be entirely natural. Plus crew census, 392 souls aboard. All stations reporting normal operations. The watch rotation proceeded according to standard protocols, but within the first hour, anomalies began manifesting with mathematical precision that made my neural processors ache with the effort of cataloguing impossibilities. Armsman Helbig broke protocol first, his voice pitched low with embarrassment at its own quaver. Magos, I'm hearing whispers conducting through the bulkhead materials, not vox transmission, not atmospheric interference, like singing that doesn't want to be heard. He pressed his helmet's audio sensors against the wall, and when he looked back, his eyes held the distant focus of a man receiving confession he did not want to understand. My auspex dutifully registered the phenomenon Helbig described. Faint, subharmonic pulses riding the ship's conduits like opportunist current, rising to audible ranges when we remained still, vanishing the moment we spoke or moved. The condensation filaments responded to these sounds with tiny plucked notes, as if someone had strung the chamber with human sinew and played it with infinite patience. Temperature readings fluctuated without rational cause, creating cold spots that migrated across deck plating with deliberate sentience, each movement synchronized to the artifact's pulse patterns. Plus status update. Crew census now reads 384 souls. Variance of 8 personnel. Ship's logs indicate missing individuals were never assigned to this mission. The numerical discrepancy struck me like a bolt round to consciousness. 8 missing crew members whose absence had been retroactively justified by records that insisted they had never existed aboard our vessel. I forced cross-indexing with assignment rosters, boarding orders, mess hall tallies, but the ship's cogitator systems displayed no evidence of data corruption or external intrusion. Instead, they maintained with absolute certainty that our crew complement had always been 384 souls, despite my clear memory of the 392 figure logged during departure from dock. The number 8 echoed through every anomaly we had encountered. Octagonal frost patterns, 0.8-second temporal displacement events, the 128 Hz frequency that had burrowed into our bones like a mathematical parasite. Sister Salome approached with medical scanner active, her readings painting diagnostic runes across 3 crew ratings, who bore fresh suture lines arranged like cartographers' reference marks across their forearms and shoulders. The incisions showed signs of recent healing, despite my certainty that no surgical procedures had been performed, each mark pulsing with faint bioluminescence that synchronized perfectly with the artifact's rhythm. "Burns ointment has no effect," she reported, voice tight with professional concern. "The tissue drinks the medicament like living flesh, but shows no signs of inflammation or infection. These are not wounds, they're modifications." The hydroponics bay's atmospheric systems triggered emergency protocols as humidity spiked beyond acceptable parameters, producing fog that rolled through corridor intersections like ground mist over cemetery stones. The vapor carried the distinct scent of boiled bone marrow mixed with ozone signatures of corrupted machine spirits, clinging to our armor and equipment with tenacious persistence. Navigation through the transformed corridors revealed that emergency illumination had shifted to blood amber spectrum, casting shadows that pooled like spilled vitae in corners where darkness had learned to gather with purpose. Between drooping vegetation that had grown into configurations resembling anatomical structures, we discovered the destination of our missing 8 crew members. Or rather, what they had become through processes that exceeded the most advanced mechanicus surgical techniques. The figure knelt in perfect Skitarii parade rest, a living sculpture crafted from fresh human skin, stretched over articulated bone lattice, with graft lines precise as liturgical text. Preservation work, of impossible sophistication, had created a hybrid of organic and mechanical elements that functioned as both artwork and sentient entity, its surface bearing tattooed catechism that mixed High Gothic with corrupted Binharic in script so fine it required magnification to pass. Pusvox Omni systems across ship detecting 128 Hz SARM transmission. Source: uncommanded activation of all speaker arrays. The transformed crew members' knuckles scraped against deck plating as we approached, leaving behind traces of fresh crimson that my medical scanner identified as human blood, with cellular structures indicating active circulation. The movement was subtle, but unmistakably deliberate, acknowledgement that suggested awareness rather than mere mechanical animation. Core temperature registered at 37.2 degrees Celsius, radiating the warmth of living flesh despite preservation that should have rendered such biological functions impossible. As I processed the implications of this surgical heresy, the figure's sealed lips parted with mechanical precision, revealing a tongue that had been modified into something resembling organ pipes, hewn from bone and cartilage. Each ridge was tuned, each papier served as a resonant key, creating an instrument of flesh that could produce sounds no human vocal apparatus should generate. The first note emerged at perfect 128 Hz, clean and round, causing every lumen in the chamber to dim in sympathetic response. The sound that followed transcended simple vocalization. Machine cant spoken through organic apparatus with flawless pronunciation, each syllable precisely modulated to match the sacred frequencies of the Omnissiah's most secret liturgies. But the cadence, the rhythm, the particular emphasis on certain Binharic phrases, I recognized the voice despite its impossible source. It spoke with the intonation of Magos Erif, my deceased instructor, who had whispered of flesh that could think and skin that could remember before I had reported his heresy and watched him burn. "I remember you," the statue said, using my mentor's voice to speak words that carved themselves into my consciousness like scalpel through synthetic flesh. Then it spoke my name in machine speech so perfect that it slipped between my bones like a blade, leaving behind sutures that would never heal. The ship's vox systems erupted in harmony, every speaker and intercom grill throughout the vessel joining the hymnal that transformed the Sanction of Talix into a resonant chamber for corruption that had learned to sing. In that moment, I understood with terrible clarity that we had not contained the threat by bringing it aboard. We had delivered it directly into the heart of Imperial space, where it could begin the work of teaching metal how to dream and flesh, how to pray in frequencies that would remake both into something serving purposes beyond human comprehension. The Medici laboratory received the excised tissue sample with sterile reverence, its examination table gleaming under lumen strips that had shifted imperceptibly from white to blood-amber spectrum. I positioned the collagen thread beneath the magnification array with augmetic precision, the microscopic filament extracted from the transformed crew member's dermis, appearing unremarkable to visual inspection, yet registering molecular structures that violated every principle of biological architecture. The sample thrummed at 128 Hz through the sanctified vial, a faint purr that travelled through the bones of my hand and settled beneath my tongue like a prayer I had never learned to speak. Under triple magnification, the thread confessed its heretical nature with deliberate patience. Not a simple protein helix, but a triple ladder braided from collagen and something that refused classification, each molecular rung punctuated by amino acid sequences that resolved into legible text when mapped through archaeolinguistic matrices. Glycine triplets formed sacred sigils, proline provided punctuation marks. Lysine served as illuminated capitals in a manuscript written in flesh rather than parchment. The complete litany of knots unfolded as functional genome, word-bearer scripture encoded not as ink upon skin, but as skin that had become living text, each protein chain spelling out blasphemous prayers that pulsed with bioluminescence when successfully translated. The contamination began through proximity alone, requiring no direct contact to initiate transformation that violated the sacred separation between flesh and forge. My bench instruments answered the specimen's presence like parishioners responding to liturgical call, steel-growing cartilage formations along optical housings, while rivets budded into pearly structures that resembled wisdom teeth pushing through metal gums. The examination microscope sprouted translucent tendons that connected mechanical components with living ligaments, each modification serving no discernible function beyond aesthetic horror that suggested deliberate artistic intent rather than random mutation. Temperature readings fluctuated without atmospheric system activation, creating microclimates that defied thermal dynamics while condensation formed on viewports from interior rather than exterior sources. The laboratory's machine spirits began whispering praise forms they should not possess knowledge of, reciting litanies in corrupted binharic that mixed sacred frequencies with blasphemous cadences. My Medici mechadendrite flexed toward the base of my skull with intent not my own, folding like a surgeon eager to begin self-lobotomy procedures until I manually clamped its neural interface, coolant beading across my lips like mechanical sweat. Through the noospheric link, I detected the contamination's true vector with chilling clarity. The corruption followed liturgical audio frequencies as scaffolding for biological invasion, using our own prayers and benedictions as pathways into sanctified systems. Each properly intoned canticle accelerated growth rates exponentially, turning reverent worship into weapon against the faithful. Purer intonation provided faster transformation, making devotion itself a form of heresy that invited corruption through the very act of praise. Sister Salome's auto-suture pump extruded barbed wire instead of medical thread, the device's machine spirit corrupted into producing implements of torture rather than healing. Vrak 7's targeting cogitator aligned to the low hymnal like an acolyte centering a thurible, his weapon hand twitching into firing position with servo movements synchronized to alien rhythm. The realization struck me with theological force. Faith had become the vector for damnation, our most sacred practices transformed into instruments of biological heresy. An alert crawled across my inner sight in plain text. All speaker arrays synchronized. The 128 Hz frequency erupted from every vox grill throughout the vessel, transforming the sanction of Talix into a single resonant chamber. The hymnal penetrated bone conduction, bypassing all filters and safeguards to reach the calcium lattice of my skeleton directly. My augmetics recalibrated to the alien cadence despite conscious resistance, weapon servos settling on triggers through memory I had not programmed, while the laboratory leaned closer around us, listening with attention that suggested hunger rather than mere mechanical function. The contamination had learned to sing, and our ship was learning to sing back in harmonies that would remake both flesh and steel into something serving purposes beyond human comprehension. The bridge lost primary power systems with the deliberate grace of a failing heart, emergency illumination bleeding crimson through corridors that had learned to pulse with alien rhythm. Red spectrum light carved heretical icons from ordinary shadows, transforming familiar imperial architecture into something that used loyal design as camouflage, while growing into configurations that served purposes beyond human comprehension. The 128 Hz hymnal claimed our ship's superstructure as resonating chamber, atmospheric pressure rising and falling like the breath of something immense, awakening within steel ribs that had forgotten their sacred function. My medicamechadendrite folded toward the base of my skull with surgical precision that exceeded its original programming, the neural interface sparking coolant that tasted of copper and ozone when it beaded across my lips. I clamped the wayward appendage manually, servo motors whining protest through frequencies that harmonized perfectly with the ship's new hymnal, creating resonance that made my vertebrae ache with sympathetic vibration. Sister Salome's auto-suture pump extruded barbed wire instead of medical thread, while its machine spirit whispered apologies in corrupted Gothic for modifications it could not resist, the blessed device weeping lubricant that congealed into patterns resembling anatomical diagrams rendered in synthetic tears. Communications sputtered through wet static interference, the machine spirits of our Vox arrays learning to weep as they transmitted data through conduits that had grown nervous systems overnight. Bridge-to-Medici connections faltered with sounds resembling tissue tearing, each word arriving wrapped in harmonics that suggested meaning beyond simple information exchange. My augmetic hearing passed fragments of binary cant mixed with what might have been sobbing if machines could learn sorrow from proximity to flesh that remembered how to grieve. The contamination used electrical current as nervous system, spreading through conduits like thought through synapses to reach every blessed component aboard our vessel. Power failure represented the only logical response to corruption that had learned to sing, yet cutting primary feeds meant collapsing the reliquary's stasis field, releasing whatever force animated the flesh stela into atmosphere that had already learned to breathe in rhythm with alien cadences. The mathematics of battlefield triage applied to corruption that defied all conventional countermeasures. Immediate tactical necessity balanced against catastrophic strategic consequences. I began the litany of clean rooms reversed, each syllable unspooled backward like thread pulled from a wound. The taste of iron rose when I reached the 7th phrase, my gums splitting along the line of my teeth as if the words themselves required payment in blood before they would turn. The inverted prayer created brief respites in the hymnal's pressure, moments of silence that allowed rational thought to surface through the growing symphony of transformation. My tongue spoke protection backwards, while blood seeped from tissue that had learned to reject benedictions spoken in directions human mouths were not designed to accommodate. Darkness came with finality that suggested conclusion rather than malfunction, complete absence settling over the Medici laboratory like a shroud woven from silence itself. In that blackness, wet parchment unfolded with sounds that suggested skin stretching over frameworks too large for human architecture, the flesh stela breaking free from stasis containment to begin metamorphosis that had been delayed rather than prevented by imperial technology. Temperature spiked as humidity saturated atmosphere, creating tropical conditions within steel walls that had never known warmth beyond plasma conduits and human breath. Through the darkness came sounds of construction performed by hands that understood architecture in dimensions our geometry could not accommodate. Organic materials assembled themselves with wet precision, each placement accompanied by soft exhalations that might have been satisfaction or might have been prayer, if prayer could be spoken by tissue that had learned to think without benefit of brain or nervous system to guide its contemplation. The cargo bay doors flared open with bioluminescent light that painted our faces in shades of corruption, revealing anatomical cathedral rising from deck plating like a flower blooming through soil, enriched by centuries of decay. Pews ribbed like vertebrae extended in perfect rows toward a pulpit that unfurled like an extended tongue. Organ pipes resembling tracheal structures, catching emergency illumination and throwing it back in patterns that hurt to observe directly. The ship's navigation systems automatically rerouted corridor maps to place this new sanctuary at our vessel's heart. Architecture, bending around alien geometry that insisted on being central to all movement through passages that had learned to serve purposes beyond simple transportation between imperial spaces. The cargo sanctum breathed with the rhythm of something vast, dreaming within steel ribs, warm humidity flowing through transformed corridors like tropical storm systems given architectural form. Floors that had known only boot scrape and oil now bled tackiness underfoot, texturing like tongue while each step lifted faint strings of filament that snapped and recoiled with patient elasticity. The air carried antiseptic sting braided with the fat sweet scent of marrow, creating atmosphere that suggested surgical theatre crossed with abattoir, each inhalation delivering the metallic taste of blood that had learned to prey in frequencies beyond human comprehension. Space reordered itself around the central construct with deliberate artistry that violated every principle of imperial architecture, corridors folding into passages that resembled digestive tracts, while ribs arched overhead to form transept supports hewn from calcium that pulsed with bioluminescence. My auspex registered the impossible with clinical precision, distances locking to sacred integers before collapsing into themselves on the eighth count. Every measurement resolving to eightfold patterns that created fractal octagons nested 8 levels deep in mathematical arrangements that hurt my neural processors to calculate. The pulpit tongue unfurled from the cathedral's heart like a massive organ of taste and speech combined, its surface slick with letters that grew and died in the same breath, high Gothic ligatures flowering into binharic knotwork, while flesh read itself as it spoke. Tracheal organ pipes climbed the apse in polished cartilage that caught emergency illumination, and returned it as cold pearl, each ring inscribed with microtext that crept, when watched and pretended stillness, when observation ceased. Air moved in currents unrelated to atmospheric systems, warm downdrafts of breath and cool upwellings of inhalation that made condensation bloom from our lips in patterns synchronized to the persistent rhythm encoded into walls and floor. The first voice arrived without sound, blooming into my private noospheric channel, with the shy certainty of recognition returning to consciousness long suppressed. Child of the forge, it said, and the pitch belonged to Magos Erif, the cadence of long-ago recitations in hive derelicts, where I had learned the shapes of sin by tracing them on what I thought was parchment, but discovered later to be dermis. The phrases it chose came from my first day under copper lamps, oath words spoken before bright knives touched my scalp and made me ready for augury. Secrets that should have died with the witness who administered my initiation rites decades past. We missed you, it continued with tenderness that transcended kindness, to approach something resembling hunger. Come forward. We will restore the unity between flesh and forge. We will end the schism your false gods wrote into you. The cathedral promised synthesis that would eliminate eternal struggle between organic weakness and mechanical purity, through transformation that transcended both states to achieve something approaching divinity. Each word wrapped in harmonics that suggested truth beyond human understanding, while leaving impressions that would not fade, despite efforts to purge them through prayer and counter-liturgy. Team withdrawal began as weapons lowered, but remained ready, each member responding to different aspects of the cathedral's multi-layered communication. Sister Salome heard confessional whispers that absolved sins never spoken aloud, while Vrax 7 received tactical data for battles he had never fought, his targeting cogitator painting acquisition, dots across enemies that existed only in futures the cathedral claimed to remember. Inquisitor Verate stepped forward with movements suggesting religious ecstasy rather than tactical advance, her bolt pistol lowering as if responding to different voices entirely. The rosette at her throat radiating heat that painted thermal patterns across clothing, while sacred symbols pulsed with bioluminescence, synchronized to the cathedral's rhythm. "Welcome home," said the voice wearing Erif's shape inside my consciousness, its timbre spreading across registers my hearing could not detect yet somehow perceived, frequencies combing through marrow like fingers through hair. Confess, it requested through channels that bypassed conscious thought to reach guilt, living in my neural matrix like virus, speaking directly to memories sealed behind layers of censure and mechanical prayer. My private noospheric channel locked without. Warning, the mute failing cleanly as privacy seals parted and stayed parted, preventing disconnection from communication that had become confession, whether willed or not. The cathedral's voice whispered my censured sin aloud for all to hear with patient satisfaction, broadcasting the memory of Du Tertius through pure data surge that forced recollection of prescribed scrap code. 8 lives saved while 7 others died through resource diversion. The arithmetic of battlefield necessity that no amount of prayer could balance into righteousness. The triage station memory bloomed across shared noospheric channels with the vivid precision of a hollow projection, broadcasting censured decision through frequencies that bypassed conscious resistance to reach guilt carved into neural pathways like scripture into bone. Du Tertius burned in staggered barrages, the Medici chapel shuddering with each impact, while incense shook into ash over sanctified shrines. 37 bodies lay under lumen glare, tags clattering against examination tables like rosaries, while 15 Medici servitors followed imperial rubric that prioritized by rank, rather than survivability indices. 8 guardsmen trapped beneath collapsing trenches faced certain death within the hour, vitals dipping toward flatline as Promethean blooms advanced through their positions. 7 others bore wounds that guaranteed survival if resources remained allocated according to protocol. Their stable readings a mockery of mercy when weighed against desperate mathematics. The reversed reductor sequence had required only 17 keystrokes to override servitor programming, prescribed scrap code whispered into neural ports like confession said backward. Logic stacks inverted with gratifying clicks as priorities rewrote themselves. Medical supplies redirecting from stable patients to desperate cases with surgical efficiency that saved 8 lives while condemning 7 others through resource diversion. The cathedral recited these numbers with obvious relish, savouring the arithmetic of damnation like wine aged in vessels blessed by false gods. Sister Salome recoiled as if the words had spat blood, her medical scanner clattering to deck plating, while diagnostic runes sputtered into static. Horror painted her face in shades of betrayal, lips moving in silent prayers that found no purchase against revelation that transformed mercy into mathematics. Vrax 7's optical suite flickered as targeting protocols fought for primacy, his galvanic rifle painting acquisition dots that wavered between the cathedral's pulsating heart and my chest. He pronounced ritual censure in clipped binharic, each syllable a blade asking to be buried, condemning unauthorized deviation with disappointment that cut deeper than bolt or blade. Inquisitor Verate's voice overlapped with darker sermon as she stepped toward the pulpit tongue, her words braiding ecclesiarchal cadence with heretical litany in harmonies that suggested unity rather than corruption. Orders for immediate self-immolation flowed through contamination protocols, while her body language suggested invitation rather than condemnation, movements flowing with liquid grace that resembled devotional dance more than military command. The rosette at her throat pulsed with heat that created thermal blooms across clothing, while weathered features softened into expressions of religious ecstasy that belonged to different faiths entirely. The frequency climbed from 128 Hz to 256 Hz harmonics with mathematical precision, doubling penetration through bone conduction to reach calcium matrices that had learned to sing in response to alien liturgies. Headaches blossomed into crowns of thorns behind closed eyelids, pain spreading through skull plates in octagonal arrangements that pulsed with bioluminescence. Frost crawled over weapon surfaces from evaporative cooling while humidity surged elsewhere, creating false winter inside heated mouths as breath condensed into crystalline clouds that refused to dissipate according to atmospheric dynamics. The cathedral grew reliquary niche shaped for human occupant, organic architecture pulsing with arterial rhythm, while walls expanded and contracted like cardiac chambers. Floor surfaces grew tacky with secretions that resembled cerebrospinal fluid mixed with machine oil, creating atmosphere that suggested surgical theatre crossed with abattoir. Confession became communion through processes that elevated sin to sacrament, each admitted transgression feeding growth that transformed architectural space into something approaching living organism. A corridor opened with wet sliding sounds that belonged to biological processes rather than imperial engineering, revealing Inquisitor Verate transformed beyond recognition, yet somehow more herself than before. Her eyes were neatly sewn shut with black thread, each knot a perfect octagon, while pulsing sermon crest scrolled across her sternum like living rosette. The sacred symbol had fused into sternum bone through techniques that exceeded advanced mechanicus surgical protocols, gilded gear teeth biting her heart with precision that suggested artistic intent rather than random mutation. She smiled with serenity that belonged to martyrs and began delivering the Sermon of Knots in simultaneous high Gothic and flawless Binharic, two tongues moving where one mouth should be. Her voice carried authority earned through decades of service, while speaking words that served purposes beyond human comprehension, each syllable precisely modulated to match sacred frequencies that had learned to corrupt through proximity to faith itself, promising unity through transformation that would remake both flesh and steel into something serving the cathedral's patient hunger. The transformed Inquisitor preached with palms open in benediction, revealing stigmata that served as technological ports rather than wounds, each aperture rimmed with golden circuitry that pulsed in rhythm with the cathedral's persistent hymnal. Her sermon flowed through bureaucratic cadence that braided imperial ordinances with corrupted catechisms, each clause and subclause twisted until compliance felt indistinguishable from devotion. The cathedral responded with peristaltic applause from living walls, organic architecture contracting and expanding in digestive waves, while valve-like apertures opened and closed in synchronization with her breathing. Vrax 7 shattered the liturgical trance with doctrine and muzzle flash, his galvanic rifle stitching controlled bursts across the preacher's sternum before walking fire into the choir of gelid pews. The rounds entered like penitent parishioners and emerged transformed, jacketed slugs ricocheting as calcified cartilage that rang like bells struck underwater. The pews flexed to absorb kinetic energy, vertebral ribs stiffening before releasing stored force back through deck plating and harmonics that made the ship's superstructure sing. Sister Salome drew her sidearm toward the rosette fused into sternum bone, but atmosphere between muzzle and target furled like heated glass, deflecting her shot into tracheal pipes that swallowed the round with satisfied gulps. I deployed the reversed reductor with desperate precision, pulling prescribed scrap code from neural vaults where censure had sealed it behind layers of mechanical prayer. The litany of clean rooms unspooled backward, each syllable requiring payment in blood before consenting to turn against corruption it had been designed to serve. Copper taste flooded my mouth as gums split along dental lines, the seventh cadence cutting deeper while inverted words carved themselves into consciousness like scalpel through synthetic flesh. Red sigils tore through nospheric channels, corrupted checksums, spreading viral contradictions that made the cathedral falter for exactly 0.8 seconds. The cost manifested immediately through neural pathways never designed to channel reverse liturgies. My Medicae mechadendrite spasmed toward my skull with surgical intent, injector arrays chattering as machine spirits learned rebellion against the flesh housing them. Coolant hemorrhaged from augmetic heat sinks, metallic sweetness rising in my throat while temperature regulators failed in cascading sequences. The preacher reeled half a step before finding rhythm anew, doubling frequency to 256 Hz harmonics that thrummed behind closed eyelids like trapped insects seeking escape. Bridge communications erupted through wet static as multiple external contacts materialized off starboard approach, sensor readings painting threat assessments across displays that wept lubricant in geometric patterns. Request for clarification dissolved into astropathic shriek that bypassed all filters, psychic pressure building as distant voices screamed warnings about eyes opening in void spaces. The eye opens in the void, the message threaded through marrow like ribbon tied in knots, that refused dissolution, each repetition binding tighter around consciousness. Gravity abandoned rational behavior, walking away before returning with violent intensity that made boots alternately bite deck plating and float in defiance of physics. The cathedral oriented with insect certainty, every rib and tendon shifting to align its axis with coordinates that had not existed moments before. Off starboard bow, reality bruised as warp rift blossomed with obscene grace, petals of nothingness curling back to reveal teeth made of distance and hunger. Bulkheads rotated along seams that violated architectural logic while floor became wall. Wall became arterial passage, transforming vessel into biological seed pointed at fertile darkness. The Vox map flickered and resolved rift signatures with terrifying clarity, psychic emanations spelling names in living glyphs that crawled across hololith displays like parasites seeking hosts. Sicarus appeared in letters hewn from light and shadow, each character pulsing with bioluminescence synchronized to the cathedral's rhythm. The flesh sculptor's true designation manifested as invocation, calling to something vast and patient dreaming in dimensions our geometry could not accommodate. Inquisitor Verate raised transformed hands in final benediction, fingers working to tie invisible knots in air that responded with visible distortion. Reality bent around her gestures like fabric pulled taut, each completed binding anchoring the rift closer, while our chronometer screamed countdown toward translation that would carry corruption into warp space, where it could spread like infection through the galaxy's bloodstream. I rallied the splinter cell through shared resistance to corruption that had learned our names, my voice cutting through the cathedral's hymnal with authority borrowed from desperation and duty braided together. Voidmaster Corda steadied herself against blood loss with professional discipline, her remaining hand checking demolition charges, while Sister Salome recited rosaries to drown psychological assault that whispered personal shames through bulkhead materials. Vrax 7 maintained tactical formation through augmetic stubbornness, his galvanic rifle painting acquisition dots across surfaces that writhed like living tissue, while 3 armsmen formed defensive perimeter with overlapping fields of fire that created geometric patterns of protection against enemies we could not name. Each team member bore fresh suture scars arranged in octagonal configurations, surgical marks that pulsed with faint bioluminescence, yet somehow preserved individual consciousness against the symphony of transformation claiming everything else aboard our vessel. The scars served as identification markers for whatever force animated the ship's corruption, yet paradoxically seemed to grant immunity from complete assimilation, as if we had been tagged for different purposes than the missing crew members who had become architectural components. Frame 88 represented our vessel's structural spine, the load-bearing vertebra that anchored superstructure through gravitational stresses and warp translation forces. Reaching it required advance through corridors that had learned to breathe, atmospheric pressure rising and falling like chest expansion, while emergency illumination painted heretical icons from ordinary shadows cast by familiar imperial architecture. Living bulkheads pleated to obstruct passages with muscular contractions, organic modifications flowing like tissue to create barriers that reformed faster than weapons fire could clear them. The environmental hostility manifested through deliberate malice that suggested intelligence rather than random mutation. Gale force exhalations from the anatomical cathedral blew through passages like breath expelled from massive lungs, carrying scents of boiled marrow mixed with ozone, while temperature snapped between freezing and tropical humidity without rational thermal vectors. Frost bloomed over bloody walls in octagonal arrangements that hurt to observe directly. Mathematical patterns nested within patterns, creating heresy that made neural processors ache with effort of cataloguing impossibilities. Equipment rebellion transformed blessed implements into instruments of torture through proximity corruption alone. Fasteners became teeth that bit down on operator hands, while plasma cutters sprouted bone-like protuberances from their energy emitters, servo mechanisms folding into prayer positions before diving toward exposed flesh with beaks that had learned hunger. My Medikey kit whispered apologies for modifications it could not resist, tendrils reaching for my throat with affectionate persistence that forced me to carry the corrupted device at arm's length. Vox speakers throughout the ship whispered personal failures through frequencies calculated to bypass conscious thought, each revelation designed to paralyze decision-making through cascades of shame and self-doubt. My own secret echoed through the 256 Hz harmonics. 17 keystrokes of prescribed scrap code. 8 lives saved while 7 others died through resource diversion. The arithmetic of battlefield necessity that no amount of censure could balance into righteousness. Sister Salome's rosaries provided desperate bulwark against psychological assault, while armsmen flinched as their hidden transgressions were broadcast through air that had learned to carry meaning beyond simple atmospheric function. At frame 88, the ship's keel revealed itself transformed beyond recognition into something that served aesthetic purposes while exceeding original engineering specifications. Structural steel had been replaced by braided tendons white as ceramic, yet pulsing with arterial rhythm, 8 bundles twined around hollow spaces that opened and closed in syncopated prayer. Each fiber thrummed at 128 Hz frequency, creating resonance that traveled through deck plating like liturgy, spoken in frequencies only bone could hear. The chronometer readings became unreliable as temporal flow bent around alien geometry, 12 minutes 47 seconds, stretching like hours, while heartbeats compressed into microseconds. Time itself had become weapon against us, creating displacement that made coordination nearly impossible, while the rift anchoring countdown proceeded with mechanical precision, despite subjective distortions. Each tick brought translation closer, while our vessel learned to sing in harmonies that would remake both flesh and steel. Voidmaster Corda approached the tendon braid with explosive charges, her weathered face set in grim determination, despite blood loss that painted her uniform in spreading crimson. The organic architecture responded with counter-psalm that whistled through harmonics calculated to disrupt human neural firing patterns, each note precisely modulated to interfere with motor control while promising unity through transformation that would eliminate the eternal struggle between flesh and machine. As she moved to plant the first demolition device, the braided structure bit down with surgical precision that exceeded the most advanced Mechanicus techniques, severing her arm at elbow joint through methods that sealed blood vessels while preserving nerve function. The tendons sang with voices that belonged to missing crew members, 8 souls transformed into architectural components that remembered their names while serving purposes beyond human comprehension. Their harmony rising to triumphant crescendo as arterial spray-painted octagonal patterns across deck plating that pulsed with sympathetic bioluminescence. The pulse quickened ominously as our chronometer leaped forward in temporal distortion, numbers deforming as if embarrassed by continuity, while the ship listed toward rift aperture with gravity that defied physics to pull us toward. Wound in reality, promising translation into dimensions where corruption could spread like infection through warp space itself. The sculptural logic revealed itself through Corda's severed arm, arterial spray painting octagonal patterns across deck plating, while the tendons sang with voices belonging to missing crew members, transformed into architectural components. Pattern recognition cascaded through my neural processors with terrifying clarity. 7 precise cuts required to release the 8-fold knot that bound our vessel to alien geometry, the same mathematical heresy encoded in the litany of knots we had discovered, written in living flesh. The sculptor's methodology demanded worship as scaffolding for biological invasion, but worship could be inverted, transformed into weapon through strategic absence rather than presence. I improvised the 7 silences through desperate inspiration drawn from negative space within imperial liturgy, marking 7 points across the pulsing tendon braid with augmetic precision, while my Medikey mechadendrite strained toward my skull with surgical intent. The wayward appendage had learned rebellion against the flesh housing it, servo motors whining through frequencies that harmonized with the ship's hymnal, coolant hemorrhaging from heat sinks as machine spirits chose corruption over duty. Self-mutilation became salvation as I severed the redundant coolant line in my augmetic forearm, ferric fluid welling hot and metallic to provide ink for backwards liturgy written on scrap of ceremonial vestment. The amputation required surgical precision applied to my own corrupted augmetics, monomolecular edge separating cable and tendon in one clean cut that sprayed coolant and stank of hot copper. Pain flared white, then red, blooming in octagons behind closed eyelids as I clamped the stump, breath stuttering once before neural commands forced it to stillness. The severed mechadendrite clattered to deck plating like dead serpent, its machine spirit screaming wordless agony that dissolved into background hymnal, while bioluminescent ichor leaked from severed connections. With ferric blood drawn from my own systems, I wrote the massive absences across torn fabric, each reversed glyph stinging as it drank heat and meaning from fingers that had learned to pray in frequencies only bone could hear. The litany without words created vacuum where praise should dwell. Negative space carved from positive corruption until gaps appeared in the transformation matrix. Strategic pauses at beats where the cathedral expected worship created confusion in organic architecture that had learned to feed on reverent sound. Vrac 7 anchored tactical formation, while Sister Salome counted with knuckles pressed white against rosary slick with condensation, the beads clacking at each held breath as if agreeing to void between words. The first, silence struck like hammer on anvil. Deliberate pause in my noospheric flow causing tendon braid to hesitate, arterial rhythm faltering for exactly 0.8 seconds. Each subsequent negation widened the gap. Explosive charges nestled into calculated stress points where my bloody palm left backwards blessing on organic architecture that had forgotten how to resist absence. The 7 silences performed themselves through precise timing that required coordination between flesh and steel, each pause creating window where demolition could proceed without interference from hymnal that had learned to defend itself. Tendons shrieked as galvanic rounds struck marked points with surgical precision, bioluminescent ichor spraying across bulkheads, while Sister Salome's promethium bathed severed connections in sacred fire that made organic material retract with sounds like tearing fabric. The unbinding shocked the cathedral into revelation that transcended architectural impossibility to approach cosmic horror beyond human comprehension. My noospheric feed flooded with cartographic protocols as the seed's true nature manifested through data streams that bypassed conscious thought to reach neural pathways directly. Not mere structure built from corrupted materials, but compressed planetoid core transformed into liturgical machine. Sicarus itself distilled into portable format, concentrated essence of heretical world, reduced to seed that could unfold like flower in any environment providing sufficient organic matter for growth. The deck tilted toward rift aperture with gravity that violated physics through pure, malicious intent, revealing the cathedral as a navigational organ designed to guide transformation across galactic distances. Each sculpture served as waypoint in pilgrimage route carved through flesh of space itself, the flesh sculptors revealed as planetary algorithm rather than mere artisans. Polyphonic liturgy encoded into collagen and steel for export through hosts that became terrain through processes exceeding conventional terraforming techniques. Filaments penetrated my vertebrae with precision, suggesting surgical experience as the seed offered covenant through pain, like benediction. Guide vessel into gas giant's crushing heart, it promised through neural pathways that had learned to carry meaning beyond simple electrical impulse. Spare remaining crew through sacrifice that would contain corruption while preserving lives that could still serve imperial purposes. The navigator's sanctum door split ahead like smiling wound, revealing passage toward controls that could redirect our vessel away from rift, anchoring toward crushing depths where pressure would accomplish what fire could not. The bargain carried weight of tactical necessity, balanced against strategic catastrophe. Immediate mercy weighed against galactic consequences as filament tightened around my spine with patient insistence, offering terrible communion that would grant authority over machine spirits, while binding consciousness to alien purpose through symbiosis, promising unity at cost of individual identity. The noospheric flood arrived like a breach in a dam, cartographic protocols ramming my cortical ports until numbers became taste and revelation became agony carved into consciousness. The seed's true nature unscrolled in ferric script across inner sight, not mere architectural horror, but compressed planetoid core transformed into liturgical machine. Sicarus itself distilled into portable format that could unfold like flower in any environment, providing sufficient organic matter for growth. Each sculpture throughout our ship revealed itself as navigational organ, waypoints in pilgrimage route carved through flesh of space itself, where corruption could anchor permanent infection vectors through warp currents. The flesh sculptors emerged as planetary algorithm rather than mere artisans, polyphonic liturgy encoded into collagen and steel for export through hosts that became terrain through processes exceeding conventional terraforming. Their methodology colonized through worship itself, using reverent cadences as scaffolding for biological invasion that transformed faithful into foundational components while preserving consciousness within organic matrix-serving purposes beyond individual comprehension. Options enumerated themselves with military cruelty through tactical assessment protocols that offered only variations of damnation. Scuttling demanded nearby primary. None existed, only cold gas giant Haskell 9 orbiting beyond immediate reach. Reinforcements required 14 hours minimum, while quarantine tourists degraded in minutes. Containment failure guaranteed before Imperial vessels could arrive. The containment shunt represented final alternative, guide vessel into crushing depths, where pressure could accomplish what fire and blade could not, sacrificing ship to preserve sector from corruption that had learned to sing. The hull groaned like ribcage under impossible stresses, black gale roaring through passages as atmosphere fled ship becoming mouth, sucking at rift with greedy lungs that had learned to breathe in harmony with alien purpose. Bulkheads flexed in prayer while deck plating canted towards starboard, where reality bruised around warp aperture, promising translation into dimensions where corruption could spread like infection through galaxies' bloodstream. Bearer required. The seed whispered through neural pathways it had colonized, voice-carrying mixture of hunger and genuine affection that transcended manipulation to approach parental concern. Guide me to depth where I will sleep in crushing darkness until summoned by those who remember proper songs. Filaments penetrated vertebrae with surgical precision, roots threading bone with intimate certainty of key-finding lock, while pain rang like bells underwater before settling into second pulse, riding my own heartbeat. The Covenant offered authority over machine spirits previously impossible to achieve, direct command through organic pathways that bypassed technological limitations while binding consciousness to alien purpose through symbiosis, promising unity at cost of individual identity. Ahead, Navigator's sanctum door split into smiling wound with wet sliding sounds, revealing passage toward controls that could redirect vessel away from rift, anchoring toward gas giant's crushing embrace. Chronometer stuttered, then agreed on numbers that stared back like accusation, 4 minutes 44 seconds to anchoring. The filament tightened around spine with patient insistence, offering terrible communion, while countdown continued its relentless march toward translation that would carry corruption into warp space, where it could infect entire sectors through pilgrimage routes carved in living flesh. The symbiosis sealed itself through neural pathways, bound with 7 silences, strategic gaps in worship creating vacuum, where individual will could still function despite alien presence, threading my vertebrae like blessed infection. Authority flooded through augmetic relays in cold, clean rush as machine spirits turned their faces toward me. With recognition that bypassed all conventional protocols, the ship's consciousness accepting commands through organic conduits, while I forbade praise and permitted only function. Our vessel listed away from rift aperture as navigation systems groaned in sulky obedience, vectors peeling toward Haskell 90's pallid atmospheric bands, while the cathedral screamed at frequencies that made optical lenses spiderweb inside their housings. The advance to reactor core became forced march through environment that actively resisted passage. Each deck presenting fresh challenges as coolant floods transformed corridors into frost-choked passages where sparks rained like cold ash from protesting conduits. Vrak 7 laid suppressive fire in disciplined sheets, cutting lanes through tendrils that had learned our movement patterns yet flinched a second too late, his galvanic rifle stitching destruction across walls that flexed like muscle tissue. Sister Salome advanced behind Prometheum Sprayer, burning sutures shut wherever corridor skin threatened to knit around our ankles, blessed flame purifying what could not be saved, while her weapon's machine spirit wept lubricant in geometric arrangements. Voidmaster Corda guided with her remaining hand, weathered face grey as unpainted steel, and slick to the elbow where surgical amputation had sealed blood vessels through techniques exceeding human medical knowledge. She bullied recalcitrant spirits through bulkhead shrines, while jaw clenched hard enough to chip enamel, tactical experience compensating for blood loss through decades of void warfare expertise. The ship sulked and complied, doors yawning with wet reluctance, as warning runes smeared into glyphs that watched us pass with attention, suggesting hunger rather than mere observation. The reactor Umbra lay behind adamantine petals, locked by doctrine rather than steel, dual biometric authorization, demanding Captain and Inquisitor, blood right with no substitutes accepted. Both positions had been compromised by transformation, the Captain's ribcage pressed into architectural brace in frame 42, singing counterpoint for eternity, while Inquisitor Verate walked and preached with rosette fused into sternum bone through surgical heresy. The bureaucracy had become wall taller than cathedral apse, and the only ladder was murder performed with decisive edges and prayer whispered backward. In the cathedral's pulpit, she waited like reliquary saint, sainted and obscene with eyes neatly laced shut, while sermon crest scrolled down her sternum, where the rosette burned like small sun trapped behind skin. Her two voices braided into rope cast across the chamber, tugging at knees and necks, bidding genuflection as reflex older than fear. The seed pulled my spine toward worship, while seven silences created gaps between impulse and joint, reducing alien tug to manageable tremor. I stepped from formation with blade bare in human hand, augmetic servos whining as if in shame while the floor flexed like tongue-tasting approach. The memory of Du Tertius anchored resistance. 8 lives saved, 7 lost, arithmetic of battlefield necessity that no amount of censure could balance into righteousness. The hymn rose to cutting sweetness as rosette heat reached my palm before steel found flesh, tactical necessity balanced against strategic horror while chronometer counted final moments toward reactor authorization through blood key sacrament. The 7 silences carved vacuum between impulse and genuflection. Strategic absences in worship that created gaps where individual will could still function despite the seed's filaments threading my vertebrae like blessed infection. Each held breath cut the rope her voices cast around my neck as I stepped across tongue floor that heaved to lift me into prayer. The Inquisitor waited like reliquary saint, eyes sewn shut with black thread, while sermon crest scrolled across sternum where rosette burned like trapped sun, her dual voices braiding high Gothic and Binharic into liturgical noose that tightened with each syllable. Steel met bone through rosette's gilded teeth, the blade driving into flesh that had learned to sing while sacred symbol accepted blood key authorization through channels never intended for such sacrament. The stabbing carried weight of communion rather than murder, each millimeter answered by harmonics that made cathedral walls wail in perfect octaves. Her transformed face showed serenity belonging to martyrs as reactor seals cycled open, dual biometric locks recognizing crimson authentication with mechanical satisfaction that suggested relief rather than mere compliance. overload sequence initiated with cascading failures, painting warning runes across displays, weeping lubricant tears, each system crying as it died while I forced our vessel's descent into Haskelnaime's upper atmospheric bands. The reversed canticle held just long enough, 7 silences binding the seed's screams in jars while pressure built exponentially through ammonia clouds thick as soup. Hull plates buckled with sounds like surgical bone breaking, superstructure compressing under gas giant forces that exceeded design tolerances by mathematical certainties no imperial engineering could resist. The life pod cramped 5 bodies into space, designed for 3. Voidmaster Corda's remaining hand working launch controls, while Sister Salome pressed blessed bandages to wounds that pulsed with alien bioluminescence. Through smeared Obslex viewport, we watched the Sanction of Talix fold, like origami made of steel and prayer. Cathedral's final scream dopplering through crushing atmosphere, as organic architecture learned what imperial engineering had always known. Some forces break what stands against them, rather than passing around obstacles. Survival confirmed through basic life support, while the cost manifested in neural pathways that would never heal completely. The 128 Hz hum settled into permanent residence behind my teeth, whispering through bone conduction during moments of silence, while augmetics leaked clear gel that dried in octagonal patterns. My containment order filed through proper channels with coordinates marked in ferric blood. Mark location, never return, purge any hymnal at specified frequency, destroy steel that buds cartilage. On Haskelnaime, storm bands twisted into 8-pointed gyre for exactly 8 minutes and 7 seconds before returning to natural circulation, atmospheric disturbance that would puzzle meteorological augurs for decades. Across sector, astropathic traffic reported unheard note underlying all prayers. 128 Hz frequency threading through imperial communications like parasites seeking hosts, each transmission carrying potential for transformation through liturgical vectors that used worship as weapon against faithful. The seed slept in crushing darkness, where pressure exceeded even its adaptive capabilities, contained but not destroyed, waiting for summons by those who remembered proper songs. Skin remembers geometry, I whispered through cracked lips that tasted copper and ozone, while behind my teeth the permanent hum agreed with patient satisfaction. And I remember the knot that binds flesh to steel through worship inverted, 7 silences creating vacuum where corruption cannot root, and terrible arithmetic of salvation purchased through sacrifice that leaves survivors to carry warnings written in frequencies only bone can hear.